You are listening to The Central Cast, a podcast for mystics and misfits just like you, recorded every week in Pasadena, California, before a live audience. Thanks for tuning in. All right. Thanks, Max. It's nice that you were singing about us being stones around the sun, because I wanted to begin today actually with a story about Galileo, the famous Renaissance astronomer. It's a divine moment, or what do they call it? A divine coincidence that you sang about that. So as many of you know, Galileo was eventually tried, prosecuted, and sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life because he had the audacity of teaching in the late Middle Ages, or sharing the fact, that's what's teaching, but sharing the fact that the earth was a stone going around the sun, as opposed to the cosmology of the medieval world at that time, that the church taught that, the earth was the center of creation and that the sun revolved around the earth. And this was based on the church's reading of certain passages out of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, that seemed to say that the earth was motionless and at the center of creation. Galileo, of course, had solid evidence following along with Copernicus before him, who really launched heliocentricity, this idea that the sun was at the center of the solar system, the known universe at that time. But Galileo had a telescope, and he could prove it. And he caught hell for it. Because again, it conflicted with the church's cosmology. It conflicted with the church's reading of the text. And in that way, it conflicted with the church's authority to define reality. A big no-no. He was dethroning the church's power over reality, it was perceived. And so he was tried and convicted and sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life to keep him quiet, stop him from sharing this audacious, troubling news. Nowadays, you'd be hard-pressed to find an evangelical or a conservative Christian who thinks that heliocentricity is at all a threat to the Bible or church tradition or our faith. Back then, it was a really big deal. Okay. You maybe are familiar with that story. What you might not know is that before all of that happened, Galileo was a very well-respected, well-liked scientist, thinker. He was part of high society back then. And he would have these dinner parties at his house where he would invite local elites and VIPs over for dinner. And they would have these stargazing parties as part of dinner. And at one of these parties, Galileo had invited Cardinal Roncalli, who was a member of the Holy Office. And the Holy Office was charged with protecting and enforcing church doctrine and prosecuting heretics. So this was a bigwig that you can imagine Galileo wanted to have over for dinner and to potentially sway and have him look through his telescope, win to his side, as it were, maybe to soften the church's reaction for what he knew was coming. And so Galileo invited Cardinal Roncalli to look through his telescope that night at the moon, which was rising over the city of Florence at that time. And as the cardinal was looking through his telescope at the moon, Galileo said to him, "And so, Your Excellency, as you can see, our sister world is not too unlike our own." And the cardinal did not respond at first, but continued to gaze at the telescope until he finally said, "Yes, but Senor, surely we can agree among ourselves that this is a mere hallucination." I think Galileo probably knew at this moment he was in trouble and that there was little chance these people could ever be persuaded by reason or even their own eyes. And this is a perfect example of what happens when we turn unquestioning faith into a virtue. Yes? Naive belief into a virtue. Where did this idea come from? That faith is a virtue and that, high moral standards means that you're a person of faith. The church has believed this for centuries, and the key scripture or story in the Bible that teaches this idea of the virtue of faith or unquestioning faith is probably the story of doubting Thomas in John's gospel. You're probably familiar with this story, right? Thomas was the only disciple, we're told, not present in the upper room when Christ first appeared to his disciples after his resurrection. And so Thomas shows up a few days later and is told by his fellow disciples, "You missed it, man. The Lord was here. He appeared to us. He's alive. He's risen." And Thomas responds, "What? You guys are smoking stuff. We saw him crucified. What are you talking about? I won't believe it unless I see him for myself and touch the scars, his crucifixion scars in his hands and feet," right? I'll put my hand into his side where they speared him, whatever. And as the story goes, Thomas was there, though, for the second appearance. Christ appeared a second time to his disciples, and this time Thomas was among them, and Jesus says to him, "Thomas, come forth, put your hand in my side, or your hand in my hands, and touch the wounds," right? And so Thomas did, and he declares in astonishment, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus replies, "You have believed because you have seen, but blessed are those who believe and yet not have seen." And that's the story of doubting Thomas. And it's usually interpreted to teach this lesson about the virtue of unquestioning faith, right? It's a virtue, we're told. This idea that faith ultimately trumps science and reason, and we should therefore lean not on our own understanding, as the book of Proverbs says, right? But trust instead what the church and the Bible tells us, regardless if it conflicts with known facts or reason. And to be fair, I want to be fair to this idea that, faith is a virtue, because maybe faith is a virtue if one's faith leads you to being a more kind and compassionate person, but it's certainly not the only thing that can, right? Faith can be a virtue if by faith we mean the courage to be, the courage to affirm life on its own terms, despite its innate difficulties. That's a kind of faith, right? The courage to be, the courage to affirm life. And faith can be a virtue if by faith we mean, faith in things like hope and love. That's a beautiful kind of faith, right? But that's not the kind of faith most devout people are speaking of when they say that faith is a virtue. They're talking about often, usually, the ability to suspend one's critical faculties and repress reason and doubt in order to believe whatever the church tells you to believe. There's nothing virtuous about that kind of faith. In fact, there's something quite unvirtuous and unethical about it, it seems to me. As my friend Tad DeLay likes to say, scholar, author, philosopher, theologian, he likes to say, prohibitions on doubt shred credibility. Prohibitions on doubt shred credibility. Any ideology, be it political, philosophical, or religious, that prohibits doubt, disagreement, dissent, the way the church has for centuries, is without credibility. Moreover, any ideology that needs to use the threat of violence in order to accomplish this and to gain adherence, the way the church has for centuries, saying, if you don't believe, you are subject to eternal torment, eternal violence in hell, or if you don't believe, you won't have a blessed life. God won't protect you. Terrible things will happen to you. You won't have God's protection if you don't be a Christian and believe what we tell you to believe. Such an ideology is morally bankrupt. It is morally bankrupt, using the threat of violence to gain adherence. There's nothing virtuous about such faith. It is by definition morally bankrupt and without credibility. And those who teach it are charlatans, grifters, con artists, even if they don't know it. We could also say, and this is really what I want to talk about today, such faith limits and inhibits our consciousness, which means that it stunts our intellectual, moral, and emotional development. And this applies to more than just faith and religion, but all sorts of ideology, political, cultural, philosophical. We are immersed in a sea of ideology, are we not? Whether we know it or not. And we all have certain ideologies that we subscribe to, whether we know it or not. These are often unconscious. Ideology often functions on the level of the unconscious. It's like the operating system on your phone or computer, right? It's operating in the background, controlling what you see, but you don't actually see the operating system itself. That's ideology. It's the lens through which you view the world and yourself and others. We all have certain ideologies that we subscribe to, whether we know it or not. It is basically the structured set of ideas and virtues and values, beliefs that inform how we see the world, how we interact with it, economically, politically, socially, etc. Now, there are certain kinds of ideology that limit and inhibit our consciousness, and there are certain kinds that elevate and expand it. The ideologies that limit and inhibit our consciousness are the ones that stunt our intellectual, moral, and emotional development. Such ideologies often share something in common in that they often are fear-based, meaning they play upon our fear of the other, fear of people from different walks of life, fear of the unknown, fear of our fear of death. And by playing on such fears, these ideologies bring out our worst qualities rather than our best. They make us mean and cruel and arrogant and ignorant. We see this happening today, not just in the church with, highly controlling religion and historically, like in that Galileo story, but we see it in the political realm too, like in the MAGA movement, where the fear of the other, the fear of queer and trans folks, the fear of migrants and Muslims, the fear of secularism and socialism, the fear of anything and anyone that challenges white, Christian, straight supremacy. And by that I mean mostly white, straight Christian men supremacy. Anything that challenges that is to be feared and resisted and attacked. And such fears are what animates so much of the right today. And again, this is something that limits and inhibits our consciousness. It limits and inhibits people's consciousness. It stunts their intellectual, moral, social, emotional development. Have you ever had a political or religious conversation with somebody, an adult, mind you, somebody with a mortgage, a career, and kids, perhaps, but it feels like you're talking to a child? Anybody know that sensation? You're having a political or religious conversation, dialogue with somebody who's an adult, but it feels like they're kind of stunted emotionally, intellectually, right? Often these adults hold ideas about the world and people from other walks of life that are frankly infantile, unsophisticated, regressive, and antiquated. Max, you sent me just the other week, a couple weeks ago, a video about how there's often a direct correlation between people who are highly religious and also emotionally immature. Why is that? Have you ever noticed that? One thing often begets the other. I think it has a lot to do with how certain kinds of religion, certain kinds of ideology stunt people's emotional development, their intellectual development, their moral development. These things are related, which is to say that it stunts their consciousness. However, ideologies that encourage openness, that encourage curiosity, that encourage the embrace of change, the embrace of unknowing, the embrace of difference and pluralism and people from other walks of life with different beliefs. These ideologies tend to expand and elevate our consciousness. They tend to produce more empathetic, compassionate people, people who can handle difficult conversations, competing truths, tolerance, flexibility. This is what maturity looks like. This is what a mature consciousness looks like. Such ideologies help us be our very best selves. They tend to enhance human well-being and human flourishing rather than diminish it. And I think our religious and our spiritual traditions can still do this for us if, and that's a big if we approach them and use them in the right way. And a good example maybe of how that might work can be seen in an alternative reading of the Doubting Thomas story that I really like, that I'm getting from the late Terence McKenna, who was, I don't know how would you describe Terence McKenna, but essentially, oh boy, I don't know. He was a thinker, a philosopher, died in the 90s, big proponent of psilocybin for everybody. But anyway, he had a great reading of the Doubting Thomas story. He pointed out that among all the disciples, it was Thomas the doubter who got to touch the risen Lord. He alone got this incredible experience because he was the only one who had his shit together enough to question and doubt the resurrection. And so the lesson is, if you question and doubt, if you dig deeper and beyond simply what the church tells you to believe, you will discover a deeper kind of faith. You will touch God, if you will. You will discover aspects of the divine that you couldn't otherwise. You will find a higher level of consciousness. Doubt, therefore, is not antithetical to spiritual vitality, but part of the very essence of spiritual vitality. And here we see how our spiritual traditions can still expand our consciousness, if we use them in the right way, if we approach them in the right way. Sometimes that means we flip them on their head, like I just did, or Terence McKenna just did, by, flipping the Doubting Thomas story on its head. That's not, I fully admit, that's not the intended reading of that story, right? The author of this story from John's Gospel did not want us to have that as the takeaway. Instead, the lesson is the virtue of unquestioning faith, the virtue of a kind of naive belief and just going along with what the church says. But in my opinion, these stories and scriptures were made for us and not us for them. Do you hear that? It's actually a play on words from Jesus's words from Mark's gospel, where he responds to the religious authorities of his day that were confronting and condemning him for violating the scriptures and breaking the Sabbath. He said to them, and this is a bombshell thing to say, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. That's an astonishing thing for a first century Jew to say, for a rabbi to say. The Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. In other words, we weren't made for religion and blind obedience to religious law and the scriptures and the tradition. These things were made for us. We're not enslaved to them. They were made for us. They're constructs made to, ideally, enhance human well-being, bring us closer to the divine, elevate our consciousness. Yes? Give us a kind of spiritual depth. Reveal deeper truths. If our text and traditions can't do that, if our practice can't do that, then we need to find ones that can, or change how we approach our tradition and our texts. I mean, that's a radical thing for Jesus to say and do. I think a lot of people read that text and just graze over that. That's really what he's doing there. You realize that the punishment for breaking the Sabbath, according to the book of the law, was death. This was no small scripture variance, some quibble he was having over a particular interpretation of the text. This was him challenging textual authority and the authority of the tradition by saying, well, the Sabbath was made for us and not us for the Sabbath. What? This is the word of God, man. What are you talking about? We're not enslaved to these things. The text and the tradition was made for us and not us for the text and tradition. The main reason why I'm convinced religion and spirituality can still be something that elevates our consciousness and enhances our well-being, it's not just because of what I just shared with you, but it goes back 100,000 years, really, to the beginning of our species and the level of cognition that we're currently capable of having. Our species, Homo sapien, is innately spiritual. We know that by looking back in time. Anthropologists tell us that human spirituality emerged about 100,000 years ago alongside language and art, cave paintings, things like that, as a way of expressing ourselves and exploring ourselves and our world and our sense of connection to our world and each other. Our spiritual, if you want to call it capacity, corresponded to us creating meaning. It was a way for us to create meaning and create community. It was part of the advent of language and art. It arose at the same time in our species, they think 50 to 100,000 years ago. But that's what we were up to early on with religion and spirituality. It was a way of making meaning, telling stories, and seeing our connections to the world and each other. That's beautiful, right? It's beautiful. And that's why a lot of indigenous spiritualities, like that of the Native Americans, which predate Christianity, of course, these indigenous religions are often very animistic and about our oneness and connection to nature and all things, and about our dependence on each other and the world around us, and how we're not the only creatures that have mind and spirit, but other creatures do too. And even the rivers and the mountains and the sun and the moon. It's all minded. It's all alive. It's all animated. That's beautiful. That was the inception of human spirituality, and we've lost touch with that, I think. Notice these early forms of religion and spirituality were not ways of controlling others, right? It wasn't this high control religion from the get-go. It wasn't a way of controlling what others thought or did. It wasn't a way of ending the conversation once and for all about God or the gods or the nature of reality. These were stories. These were expressions of our experience with the world and each other, being conscious, sentient, intelligent beings that we are. These early forms of human spirituality were not inflexible, fear-based, rigid belief systems that you had to convert to or else. No. That approach to religion came later on with the birth of empire and conquest and imperialism, and as small bands and tribes and communities of people became larger and more complex civilizations with economies and social hierarchies, religion in that context became just another instrument of power. Yes, it became just another instrument and expression of power, and that's where you get these kind of rigid, violent, fear-based, belief systems, convert or die, right? Conquest. Our gods are better than your gods, etc. But originally, it wasn't that way. Religion, and if you want to call it that, but spirituality began alongside language and art as a way of expressing ourselves and exploring ourselves in our world, creating meaning and community. It began as a way of elevating our consciousness. It was part of this human experience of the rise of consciousness, the rise of awareness. And it should still be that way, I believe. That's what I'm trying to reclaim here. That's what we're trying to reclaim here as a spiritual community of post-evangelicals, in a sense, exploring what it still means for us to be spiritual. In a sense, we're getting back to that original human root of spirituality. It's beautiful, I think. Some anthropologists call our species not just Homo sapien, which means the thinking ape, but Homo religiosus, which means the religious ape. I love that. Author Karen Armstrong puts it this way. She says, Homo sapien is also Homo religiosus. As soon as we became recognizably human, 100,000 years ago, whatever, we started creating religions, where we really started creating spiritual traditions and myths and these kinds of things. Religions are more complex systems, but you get the point. And I think it makes sense why we did this as a species early on. Because, let's be honest, being human is weird. Yes? Being alive, being conscious, being self-aware, being as intelligent as we are, seeing the patterns in nature that we do. This is weird, this human experience. And let's be honest further, nature is really weird. And human beings have always had weird, paranormal, if you want to call it that, spiritual experiences. This has always been part of the human experience, to have weird, paranormal, spiritual experiences. So it makes sense why our species is spiritual, why we have this innate spiritual inclination. It is fundamental to who we are as a species. Therefore, it isn't something we need to outgrow and do away with. It's not obsolete, the way so many modern thinkers and reductive materialists advocate today, saying things like, oh, religion and spirituality is the stuff of our infancy as a species. It's a carryover from our infancy, like the way we all used to believe in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny as kids, right? We have science now. We no longer need spirituality. Thank you very much. It's destined for the trash heap of history. Obviously, I completely agree with critiques of superstition and fundamentalism, right? But this idea that that's all religion and spirituality is, this is a really impoverished, reductionistic, and frankly unscientific take on spirituality, ironically enough. Science tells us through the fields of anthropology, psychology, and other fields that human beings are spiritual animals. We are spiritual animals that need this deeper sense of meaning and connection to the world and those around us. Yes? So let's embrace this. Let's embrace our healthy, life-giving, and consciousness-elevating forms of faith and spirituality. And let's resist those forms that limit and inhibit our consciousness. All right, there's my talk for today. And as always, we want to open it up for questions, for dialogue. I've got a couple of prompts here if we need them. Not that these are going to work either, maybe, but we'll try. Let me ask you this. What ideas, practices, beliefs, oh, thanks, Bob. What ideas, practices, beliefs, books, people, substances have elevated your consciousness? Or what things have limited or inhibited it? Anybody want to address that one? Or perhaps, what does it look like for you in your life and circumstances to embrace or embody a higher level of consciousness? Anybody want to speak to any of that today? Yeah, Abe.
I think for me, I guess, even when I was more religious, I was still driven by a lot of curiosity about, MS. I think, in essence, why I landed where I landed
Yeah,
with regard to Christianity. And that is still, even when I was conservative, I felt most excited and rewarded by learning things, by just knowing more things than I knew yesterday.
yeah,
And that led me sort of out of conservative Christianity, but it has persisted into my adult years, and it's still kind of the source of the most, you know, joy that I have,
yeah.
it's
Oh, wow.
just,
That's profound for you to say that.
yeah, it's
Wow.
just, so it's, I don't know, I think it's that sort of, again, it's just curiosity. It's a sense of curiosity, and it in a way, it's it obviously feels good to do good things for other people, that sort of thing. But in terms of like individual satisfaction,
Yeah, yeah.
I think it still is like, it's just learning, and knowing more, and kind of satisfying that sort of sense of curiosity I've had even when I was very young. So
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. Wow. Yeah, if no one else has raised their hand, I just was going to comment. Oh, in. Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to, you immediately made me remember something about my experience in both undergrad and grad. So, undergrad and seminary, about how my approach to biblical studies and theological studies was really different than that of most of my colleagues, in that I approached it, I'm like, I'm on a journey to discover what ultimate reality is here. And wherever the facts lead me is where I want to go. I'm starting from a place of Christianity, but I was open-minded enough to be like, I was curious about other traditions. I was curious about critiques of my own tradition because I wanted to know. I wanted to know the truth with a capital T. And I wasn't beholden to this idea, this kind of epistemological starting point or restriction that, well, it's the Bible and period. And if anything is beyond whatever the text tells me, then it's wrong. No, I was like, I wanted to know what ultimate reality was and what the truth was. And I was honest enough, maybe that's another way to look at it. I was curious and honest enough, like you were, to be like, well, maybe my tradition is wrong. Maybe my point of view needs to be corrected. Radical as that that level of humility is, it's not radical. That level of humility. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't know everything. Maybe I need to learn something. I approached it from that, and it led me here.
yeah, I think some people are a little more motivated by a sense of security. Like I've had conversations about, like, with one of my brothers, for instance,
Yeah,
about this type of thing, and he is more motivated by. It's not that he doesn't have any curiosity; he does,
right.
for sure. But he tends to be more motivated by a sense of security, about just like, hey, there's a baseline, and this is what I accept as being true, and I'm not hugely motivated to dig into the deeper levels of that, you know? And so he is more religious. He's happy. He's got a great life, got a great family, all that kind of stuff. So I don't necessarily think it's, oh, there's only one way to live and you
Yeah,
have to do it exactly that way or you will never be happy.
yeah, yeah,
I just sort of like we are different people, and everyone is different and finds happiness in different ways.
yeah.
But I do think that that's like one of the big distinctions, especially within like conservative Christianity. I think people that stay in it tend to favor, a sense of intellectual security
Yeah.
more than, all right, I'll go anywhere. It doesn't matter how terrifying the truth might
Yeah.
be. I want to know it. I think they kind of like are just less interested in that kind of pursuit,
Yeah.
you know?
No, and I think thank you for sharing that. Yeah, good stuff. And
I think I'm gonna say something that, like, is blatantly obvious and most people here probably have experienced, is that, like, my least curious part of my life was when I was in fundamentalist Christianity, because that's inherent to it, it's necessary for it.
yeah,
And what changed was, I think, well, intellectual curiosity is a piece of it. I'm a very logical person, so when
yes,
logic didn't logic, things started to unravel. But I held on for a very long time. Like I just eased my way out over a period of decades. I mean, it took a long
it's a
time.
slow burn.
It was a very
I think
slow
for most
burn.
of
It
us,
was
yeah.
really, really slow and painful. But the difference now, when I think about it, is purely the lens.
Mm,
Like it's the like now I feel like when I gave up critically, when I gave up the idea of scripture being infallible and inerrant, was when I could look at it more honestly and say, "Oh, that doesn't make sense. I'm gonna not accept that." Or this is my experience of life and it doesn't match up and my experience does have value
mm,
and does mean something. Like all of those things that I was actively taught, not just subtly taught, actively taught. Your experience doesn't matter. What
right.
matters is the truth.
Lean
And the
not on your
truth
own
is
understanding.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And doubly so as a woman. Y-
yeah.
you're told, you're being dramatic, you're
You're too
being
emotional.
emotional, you can't rely on your emotions, all of the
Yeah,
things, all of
yeah.
the things. And then starting to realize like, wow, other religions have truth in them as well. It's like, wait a minute, what? How could that
Yeah,
be? You know,
yeah.
um, it's, something you just said made me think of something that I had a conversation with a friend who's very conservative Christian just this week, and I said, I know you're not going to agree with this, so let's just preface it with that. I know you're not going to agree with this, but I feel like when we are talking about God, he was talking about God and different people's perceptions of what that word means. I said, we form God in the image of what we need emotionally, individually.
Sure,
So the
absolutely.
one who needs more security, I needed that for many years. So I suffered with the inconsistencies that I was having trouble with because I needed the security of the system that I was in that I
Yeah,
didn't know how to not be in.
yeah.
So I had a friend who was a strict Calvinist, and he and I would have passionate conversations
It's one way to put it.
about and I grew up fully not Calvinist, and so I couldn't conceive of predestination. Like,
Yeah.
no, it's free will. And so he and I would have long conversations about this. And so I was telling my friend the other day, but he actively said, I need to believe this because I know if I don't believe God is in control, if God isn't in control,
Yeah.
I know the moment my feet hit the floor, I will sin. God has to be in control. He needed that. And I fully, as a very independent thinker in my way, even though it took me a long time, fully needed to feel like I had free will and choices.
Yes.
I needed that. And so we had to believe what we needed to believe. And I think I try to give people some when they're not using it in abusive ways, but when it's just for them personally,
Yeah.
you believe what you need to believe because that's what you need. I can't. take that away from you and leave you with what? You would be lost.
Yeah.
Any more than you could force me to believe what you believe, because then you're taking away my autonomy. I can't have that. And so, like, I don't know. I've lost my connection to what you were
No,
saying, but
I
I
know. I
was
think it
just
goes
trying
right
to
along with this
tie
idea
it
of
up.
what does it mean to embrace a higher state of consciousness, a
Yeah.
higher level. It's this ability that you have right now in your life, Anne, to hold compassion for folks that didn't get to where you're at, but they still are human beings who deserve love and connection and worth and dignity, and we don't have to, disparage them. We don't have to be fundamentalists now with what we
Exactly. We
believe,
don't
so to
wanna
speak,
be that.
right?
And they're
Um,
honestly trying to pursue it in their way as
there,
much as
there's a
I'm
level of
honestly.
maturity, and I'm using this language, elevated, higher level of consciousness there in your life as a result of your spiritual journey that's able to look back and hold space for them. I think that's beautiful. I think that's part of where we're at. That can be very difficult, especially for those of us who are in recovery and still bear the wounds. Or as Max put it, the axe forgets what the tree remembers. And we're all trees with the scars, so
Yeah.
to speak, right? But no, I think it's beautiful. But that's part of what it means to kind of grow up spiritually.
Mhm.
It's be able to hold space for that.
And
I
be
don't I don't know if
compassionate with
they
your own self.
and I don't know how good they are at holding space for us.
But what they do is not my
No,
responsibility.
I
It's what
know.
I do.
I completely agree. Yeah. And I think it's also important to recognize, especially in this social climate that we're in today, that, one of the critiques I've heard that is pretty good against kind of like deconstructed Christians is coming directly out of the Black community has been, you have to understand white, educated, deconstructed, evangelical, that the way that religion functions as a social technology for communities that have been oppressed is totally different than the way you
Power.
privilege. Yeah. And so you got to be really careful about the way that you want to go into communities who have been systematically oppressed and say, well, you just need to get over God and get on with your lives like we have. You don't understand the way that some people are doing theology for survival. That's the best way I've heard it put. Some people are doing theology for survival, not just oppressed communities, but people who are in recovery from addiction,
Mhm.
people who are in AA. We had someone here, I won't say his name, years ago was like, Aaron, I love what you guys are up to. I love 90% of what you have to say, but I'm in recovery and I can't do this deconstruction thing anymore because I need this in order to stay sober. I need this belief in a particular understanding of God that I inherited from my Christianity. Might be wrong, but this is where I'm at, and this is what's keeping me sober. I completely respect that.
Mhm.
You know, the inclination I might have to be unsettled by that, or feel anxious about that, or feel critiqued by that, I have to sit with that, right?
Right.
Like as hopefully somebody that's grown and matured, you have to sit with the difficulty of that, the anxiety of that. That's okay.
Mhm.
We can do that. It's okay. So that's kind of the deeper level of where that's at. Yeah. It's messy. And
Messy.
it's okay that it's messy.
Right.
Get over that it's messy, right?
Right.
That's part of what maturity can look like too. It's messy. Feel the anxiety? Okay, good. Sit with it. That's life. Embrace it.
Mhm.
Make peace with it. Yeah, somebody else.
Yeah, Aaron, that's interesting. I was thinking about hey. I was thinking about that too, just what you're talking about, that there is this reality that what we are able to do in a community like ours is very privileged in like a point of history, but also place of the world. But as you were talking, it made me realize too that now it's gone. No, it made me realize that we do, we do kind of deconstruct to what we need, and that we're in a place where our society has improved so much over the basic conditions of being human that we have the time and space to think about this. Like, we're not living in a world where 75% of children die in adolescence. Like these, we're not working every day to, farm so that we have enough food to get through a winter.
Yeah.
We have the space to think about these things. And that's actually wonderful human progress. And some of these things are just like holdovers. I like the way you talked about that from marginalized and oppressed communities, though, that the whole approach is very different. And one of the things I thought when you were talking, Anne, was like there's so much of this like ability to ask these questions that is also willful. I'm like, I remember my in-laws were in town many years ago and came to church on Sunday morning at Central.
Uh-oh.
And Aaron kept the heresy to a dull roar, as Max likes to say, which was really great. And then we opened it up for discussion, and you all in the congregation couldn't keep things under wraps. No, and we had one of the people who shared was openly gay and talked about their spiritual experience, and then another member of the church talked about their experience having an abortion, like two like just
Wow.
super fiery
Yeah.
issues
Yeah.
for my in-laws
Yeah.
especially. So we came back and we were like, okay, we need to sit down and have like a really long conversation. We need to talk about all this stuff. And I would just never forget that in the middle of the conversation, my father-in-law said, well, I know what I know. And that was it. And it was done. There was like no more
Yeah.
discussion about anything at all. I'm like, oh, there's a point where you can do this. You just are choosing not to for what it represents. And so, it's just so fascinating. I also know because of that, he will never listen to this podcast. So it's okay for this to be on.
Yeah. Good stuff. Anyone else this morning? Yeah, Anna.
This question, but I was just trying to think like this is when I wish more of Jesus's life was recorded, or like more people wrote more stories about it.
Yeah.
Because like in thinking of the things and the beliefs and ideologies that inhibit our critical thinking or our elevated thinking, like trying to do that now, I can think of examples on like a very personal level, but if we're trying to like challenge or live in such a way or maybe change ideologies more at the systemic level, like what was Jesus doing? Like, because it was pretty radical, like the way he lived, but I don't know, like how challenging was it overtly? Like there was the religious authorities, but I don't know if he was the one going to them, or it was more like they didn't like what they saw and they preached against him, and then he like
Sure.
I don't know how, like he just lived his life with the disciples and groupies and meeting with people who the authorities didn't like. But I'm just thinking like, how was he just living kind of very personally and then addressed like the external criticisms, or was it almost like more overt in a very intentional way to get, not to like seek attention, but to almost like try to project more change outward?
Yeah, these are really good questions. The problem is that the only access we have to the so-called historical Jesus is really through the four Gospels. There is no really extra biblical historical writings about the historical Jesus of Nazareth from like Josephus or other Roman historians from the time period, which is problematic for conservatives who generally don't want to admit that that's problematic. But my point in saying that is that all we really have is what's called the Jesus tradition, which is what we find in the Gospels, which in my opinion, and that of most biblical scholars, should not be taken as literal history like you're reading a newspaper and what's happening there is verbatim what actually occurred in space-time in that moment. You're reading the Jesus tradition that grew up around the memory, I believe, a kernel of an actual, if you want to call it that, like a seed of an actual person who probably lived, died, and did incredible things. But that tradition is what we have, and it's beautiful, and it's meaningful, and it's profound, and it completely changed the world, and it completely changed the Western world, and then of course the rest of the world. But that's all we have, Anna, and that's beautiful. For me, it's enough. But when we start asking questions, what did the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth think, do, and what was his intentions and motivations? We have no idea. We have the tradition, and we got to go with that. And the tradition is beautiful and wonderful and rich. And I just want to speak from the tradition and embrace the tradition and use it to bring healing and life and renewal. But do I know anything about the historical Jesus of Nazareth? No, I'm sorry, I don't. Yeah. Is that a fair answer?
Yeah.
I don't know. Is it unsettling? I don't know. Abe, go ahead. Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
I 100% agree with all that. But you can speak sort of probably.
Yes, I think so.
So I'll speak probably.
Please.
Because I think generally even here, but mostly among a lot of progressive Christian communities, we probably tend to soften what the actual historical person of Jesus, what he taught. And he probably did talk about this coming kingdom of heaven.
Yes.
That's probably was one of the core things, because there was a great tradition of these kinds of like apocalyptic type of
Yes.
rural countryside,
wild-eyed John the Baptist types.
outside of Jerusalem or in the interlands of Israel, and Jesus was probably one of them, and he specifically challenged the authority of the priests and scribes in Jerusalem. Probably very what led to his crucifixion was probably some kind of confrontation in the temple where he specifically, went in there and he, got a little bit too fierce and they just decided to kill him. So it's I think that the things that we tend to focus on, the Sermon on the Mount, all those kinds of things, there's probably, some reason to think that some of that is pretty accurate, but I also tend to think that we probably don't think enough and pay enough attention to the fact he probably was a bit of a fire breather also.
Yeah.
He, was on the cusp of being a revolutionary, because there were not only those at his time that were straight up, advocating for political revolution and overthrow of the Roman authorities and all that kind of stuff. But only a couple of generations later, you had a full blown, rebellion in that area. And so it's he was kind of one of many people that were kind of doing similar things and sort of playing with religion, playing with politics, challenging, testing those boundaries, testing all those boundaries and slowly, because I think as a people, they were working towards a full-blown rebellion against the Roman authorities.
Yeah.
And the, sort of Jewish authorities that were essentially collaborating with.
Yeah. No, thank you, Abe. That really needed to be said. And I just wanted to add on top of that in response to you, Anna. I think Jesus of Nazareth, the historical Jesus of Nazareth, was reactionary. You asked what he was. Was he overtly reacting to his outside external environment, or was he more internally focused on his own revealed truths to himself? I think he, like we all are, I think he was a product of his day and time, his political, social circumstances, his religious circumstances certainly as well. But he was a reactionary. I mean, these guys were apocalyptic, fire-breathing, like John the Baptist. There's lots of scholarly work done on this idea that he was a disciple of John the Baptist. He came out of this kind of, fringe, apocalyptic, fire-breathing, prophetic, repent, the day of the Lord is at hand, judgment is nigh, the kingdom of God is at hand, and the powers that be, the principalities and powers, the rulers and authorities are being shown wanting, and they will be brought low, and the way of the Lord shall be established in our midst, and the poor shall be exalted, and the rich will be brought down, and the suffering and the oppressed will be liberated, etc. That wasn't just Jesus's message. That was the message of a lot of these apocalyptic prophetic voices in that day. And maybe the Jesus tradition is an amalgamation of a bunch of guys back then who were doing this work and were taking up the side of the poor and the powerless against the religious rulers and the Roman authorities, which were totally in cahoots to oppress and exploit. And they caught hell for it, and a lot of them got crucified probably. And, okay. I think that's awesome. I think that's incredible. I think that's a tradition worth hanging on to and to speak out of. And we can fully acknowledge these things. I think it's great. But yeah, I think he was reacting to his external world. Good stuff. All right, we went a little bit over and we went on a tangent, but I love that. Very cool. Let us conclude, as we always do, with this positive affirmation, joint benediction. As we deconstruct, we also reconstruct, right? No, that's cool. Beautiful mountain scene there. All right, let's say this together now. As we go from this place, we commit ourselves to the path of love, honesty, and humility. We dedicate ourselves, as Christ did, to the cause of justice and the courageous embrace of this life, this world, and each other. Amen. Thanks for being here, everybody, and thanks to all of you who joined us online and listened to the podcast later. Thanks for listening in on this week's edition of the Central Cast. Hope you enjoyed it and hope you join us next time.
Bye-bye.